Good afternoon, good evening to all participants. Thank you for joining us in this webinar. My name is Susana Siar and I'm a Fishery and Aquaculture Officer at the FAO Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific in Bangkok. The study that will be presented today is an output under a letter of agreement between FAO and INFOFISH. The COVID-19 pandemic affected all aspects of our lives and livelihoods. The pandemic exposed the vulnerabilities of fisheries and aquaculture value chains and the livelihoods dependent on this. The webinar will present preliminary findings of a study on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on small-scale fisheries and aquaculture in South and Southeast Asia and sheds light on how they coped as a result of the lockdowns and other measures to contain the spread of the virus. The study and this webinar contribute to the International Year of Artisanal Fisheries and Aquaculture 2022, or IAFA 2022 for short, which was launched on November 19. IAFA 2022 aims to focus world attention on the role that small-scale fishers, fish farmers, and fish workers play in food security and nutrition, poverty eradication, and sustainable natural resource use, thereby increasing global understanding and action to support them. Before handing over the floor to Sherlyn and Sujit, let me encourage you to post your questions later and comments by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Let me hand over the floor now to Sherlyn Antonisamy and Sujit Das of INFOFISH, who will be delivering the presentations. Over to you, Sherlyn.
Thank you, Susanna. Let me just share the screen first. Are you able to see my screen?
Yeah, it's clear, Sherlyn. Thank you.
All right. So, hello, everyone. And it's really nice to be here at this event to present the findings of this study. And we are honored to have partnered with FAO in undertaking this study to see the impacts of the COVID-19 on the small-scale fisheries amidst this COVID-19 in South Asia and Southeast Asia countries. So let me give you a little brief introduction. In general, most of us have experienced, and rather we still, to a certain extent, undergoing, seen the implications and the effects of this COVID-19 pandemic. And it has been creating not only challenges for the governments at every level, but also at the core, it's a challenge for the well-being of families and communities across the globe. South Asia and Southeast Asia are not exceptions in terms of how they have endeavored to cope, adapt, overcome, and even survive during this period. This FAO INFOFISH Commission study surveyed the effects of COVID-19, as I mentioned, on small-scale fisheries, fisherfolk, aquaculture operators, fisheries-based business operators. 8 countries across South and Southeast Asia were selected, namely Bangladesh, Cambodia, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Sri Lanka, and Thailand. And both the pre-pandemic and the current pandemic period were taken into account to compare in this study. To undertake this study, structured questionnaires were done with the primary focus on the key questions, which I will share shortly, on the impacts of the pandemic, the measures that have been put in place, government interventions or policies, segments which have survived, how innovations played, and including the gender dimensions to this. As I mentioned, the key questions that went into, or rather were the crux of the questionnaires that were designed for this purposive study, are among those: what has been the impact of the pandemic on the small-scale fisheries and aquaculture operators' lives and food security? What interventions, policies, measures did the governments implement to support the small-scale fisheries and the businesses? What other measures were put into place to alleviate social suffering or support the economy? And how did the small-scale fisheries aquaculture sector benefit from these? What measures were put in place to contain the COVID-19 pandemic and how this affected the small-scale fisheries? What new small-scale fisheries and aquaculture businesses were started during the pandemic and how these, and what are the reasons that they continued to survive? Which businesses survived during the pandemic and why? What innovations were implemented to mitigate the impact of the pandemic by small-scale fisheries, and what good practices that can be identified and shared? What are the gender dimensions of the innovations, good practices, recovery, and adaptation strategies? And in all these questions, the gender dimensions of these impacts were put into question as one of the main areas that we were researching into. So the prelude, or rather the a quick snapshot of what we have sort of researched thus far, as mentioned by Susanna. This is a preliminary results that we are presenting. Is what is apparent is while the pandemic's challenges remain present in terms of health concerns for in general, also brought about restrictions and lockdowns, which greatly impacted the small-scale fisheries and aquaculture farmers across the countries, and by disrupting the supply chains. Very important to note that the demand for seafood remains robust in this region. However, the restrictions and lockdowns were the ones that primarily hampered the business operations and affected the industry. Government intervention support remains a mixed bag in terms of responses from what we've received a response from, both positive and negative. How the small-scale fishers, aquaculture operators, and fisheries-based businesses responded were also varied according to the country and also to the level of restrictions or lockdowns that were imposed. And a general observation was there is a general decline in the industry attributed to these segments. However, the sector has proved resilience towards the impact of the COVID-19, and this was basically through diversification or substitution of household income to other agricultural activities, streamlining of business costs to an absolutely essential level, and embracing more digital innovations to conduct businesses. So the agenda today, after this, after my quick introduction to the objectives, will be the methodology which will be presented by our colleague Sujit Das, who's the technical officer with INFOFISH. We will then present the preliminary findings of 6 countries. 6 countries because we are still in the midst of finalizing the results from 2 other countries. And then we will look at the preliminary conclusions and the outlook, and then we'll open up the floor for some question and answers. So without further ado, let me just hand over the session now to Sujit. Over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Shilin. Let me allow to share my screen. Yes, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So welcome everyone, and a very good day to you all. I'm going to present the methodology and the preliminary findings of 3 studies. So for better understanding, my video will be turned off. Stop video. Just a second. So I will discuss about the methodology applied for this study. I can tell you here that this study was conducted in a collaboration with the FAO and INFOFISH, and we are very glad to be a part of this study and the timely study. And what I'm going to provide you in this short presentation, the methodology applied for this study and the country-specific information, including the study area, gender dimension, number and types of respondents, etc., and what challenges we faced during during conducting this study. So for introducing or the commencing this study, it was determined that 100 respondents will be included, representing the small scale fisher folks, aquaculture operators, and the fisheries-based business operators that we call FBOs here, and the government officials. And we considered 8 countries, including Bangladesh, Cambodia, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Thailand, and Sri Lanka. Why we considered these 8 countries? Considering all these countries are the FAO member countries, and the contribution from fisheries and aquaculture for these countries to their respective national economy is tremendous. And we also considered that on these 100 response representation, it was represented by 35% the small scale fisher folks, and 30% were from the aquaculture operators, and 30% from the fisheries based business operators, and the rest 5% were from the government officials. And as discussed by my colleague in earlier introduction, the pre-structured questionnaires were followed for this study, and also the face-to-face interview, virtual and mobile interview are also applied to collect the field data, and also for collecting the individual responses. And for better understanding, and also for the receive the maximum responses from the respondents, the questionnaires were translated in local languages, in different languages, like the Bengali, also from the Khmer and other languages as well. And it was also considered that the gender dimension, that is the equal participation of male and female, were considered. However, it was not maintained for all the countries. And at least 4 case studies were selected for each country representations, including the small scale fisher folks, aquaculture operators, and the FBOs. Considering the limited time, it was a rapid assessment, and we used non-probability purposive sampling. Although there is no formula for setting a sample size in purposive sampling, a rule of thumb between 50 to 150 respondent can be included for this purposive sampling. And we use the reference of this study conducted by UN WFP conducted in 2007. So we use this reference for this study. Now I'll go country by country. What specific information I want to give you, what study areas are covered, number and types of respondents covered in the specific countries like Bangladesh. The study area covered the northeastern, southeastern part, southwestern part, and also the central Dhaka, Mymensingh, Kishoreganj area, and also the northern part of Bangladesh, including the Rajshahi. Why these areas? These areas are mostly the small scale and aquaculture dominated areas, and the impact was also in these areas most. And they got 95 respondents during this study, including the 29 small scale fisher folks, 33 aquaculture operators, and 28 fisheries based business operators, and 5 key government officials. However, gender participation was not adequate for study while conducting study in Bangladesh. Only 4 respondents were included for the case studies, and the face-to-face interviews were were conducted during this study for collecting all the necessary information according to the designed questionnaires. And also the 5 government officials were included in this study. Now look at the Cambodia. Cambodia, they considered 113 respondents, including 44 small-scale fishers, 32 aquaculture operators, and 31 from the FBOs, and 6 government officials. And the six areas dominated by the small-scale fishers and the aquaculture were included in this survey. And the figure 5, we see the composition of male and female among the respondents were quite satisfactory in case of Cambodia. And they also conducted 5 case studies, which I'll also present one case study here. Next, India. India is one of the most impacted by COVID, and which the preliminary study, what we are going to share today, it will also reflect the situation. And they included 6 important maritime states, including the Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, Odisha, Kerala, Gujarat, and Maharashtra, where these states are considered the mostly dominated by the aquaculture and the small-scale fisheries industries. And they included a quite wide number of respondents, 165, including 42 small-scale fisher folks and 46 aquaculture operators, and also the 69 FBOs and 8 government officials. So the interview were done by face-to-face interview and followed by the mobile interview. And we can coming to the in Indonesia. In Indonesia, we see they covered a wide area, wide regions, including North Bengkulu to up to Ambon. And they also in figure 9, we see that there is a very good, not good, more or less, I can say, in compared to Bangladesh and India, the participation from male and female were adequate in Indonesian survey. And these data obtained from the survey were compiled and simplified by using Google Forms, and a specific attention were given to business sectors who have managed to overcome the impact of pandemic and presented in the case studies. Now, in case of Malaysia, we have seen that the regions covered Selangor, Pahang, Sarawak, Perlis, Perak, Negeri Sembilan, and Pulau Pinang. In the figure 10 explains this, and we also found a very good representation of male and female in case of Malaysia. And they, including their 95 respondents, 28 were from the small-scale fishers, 27 from the aquaculture operators, 36 from the FBOs, and 4 key government officials. Last, I'll put light into Thailand, and we found in case of Thailand, the most respondents for this study were from the Western region, followed by the Central region, and also the Eastern, Southern, and the Northeastern and the Northern region. Figure 12, it expressed these areas. And in case of participation of gender participation of, we found it was quite good compared to the 5 countries I discussed earlier. And we have seen that they included 101 respondents, and from among them 34 were female, that is the 33%, more than 33%, and 67 were male. So that the male percentage were 66%. But this comparison is more better than other countries. And the respondent consisted of 35 small-scale fisher folks, 30 aquaculture operators, and the 30 fisheries-based business operators, including 6 government officers. So what were the challenges during this study? We found the COVID-19 itself was one of the key challenges for conducting these studies. Why we had to make delay to starting a study in some countries due to the intermittent lockdowns, and also the enumerators also taking time for submission, taking more time for submitting their questionnaires. And we also found that, interestingly, the natural disasters like Cyclone Amphan in India and Bangladesh, and some in Sri Lanka, the flood also affected this study. And so we have found various challenges, including the natural, and also the COVID itself is one of the major challenges in conducting the impact of COVID study. So thanks for your attention for my methodology presentation. Now I am going to my next presentation. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Thank you. So now I'll give you a highlight of the preliminary findings of the 3 countries, Bangladesh, Cambodia, and India. First, Bangladesh alphabetically. What were the impacts we observed during this study? The impact of pandemic on the small scale fisheries. We found that in case of Bangladesh, unfortunately, we didn't. They didn't include any female respondent in their study, and during the pandemic, we found the status quo remains. Regarding the livelihoods, the fishing was the key livelihood, followed by the agricultural activities, and also some of them are doing the daily laborers and rearing livestock, fish selling, and aquaculture. And during the pandemic time, the livelihood continued to be the main, the fishing, where the main source of livelihood for most of the respondents. And in case of household income, the study revealed that the US dollar 1916 US dollar annual, the household average annual income was found 1916 US dollar. So there is a general decrease in household income was observed. It was about 21.2%. And regarding the businesses, the small scale fishers focused on the fishing in ponds in Bangladesh, and also rivers, seas, and also in the back swamps, also in the mangrove swamps, and sometimes they glean the crabs and eels. So their businesses during the pandemic time, their businesses declined at an about 20% in case of value, decline in value of fish and fishery products. And also it has been observed that the Bangladesh faced some cancellation of live export of live eel and crabs, including shrimps. And it has also observed that they hardly maintained the COVID-19 protocols. And here on the right side, the figure 1 shows the changes in their average household income. In case of aquaculture operators, the respondent included only 7% of the were the women. During the pandemic time, actually the status quo position remains. And regarding livelihood status, primary occupation was the farming, aqua farming, followed by the agriculture and the livestock rearing, and some in some cases they do small businesses like shopkeeping. And during the pandemic time, interestingly, their income revealed a slight increase, 4.67%. And their household income also found varied between US dollar 1,285 to 34,000. Is a huge range, although 34,738 US dollar. And average trend of household income was revealed at the 4.6%. So it indicates in Bangladesh, the aquaculture operation was not hampered, and it continued. Regarding the businesses, fishing, agriculture, livestock rearing, gleaning of crabs and eels, and these are all they are doing frequently. And also in Bangladesh, the species farmed are the Indian major carps, small indigenous species, and also the tiger shrimps and the freshwater prawn, tilapia, pangasius, and there are also rice fish farming and also the floodplain fisheries. So during the pandemic time, their businesses not impacted seriously, except the cancellation of some export order, as I mentioned in my earlier slide. And so the profit margin minimized due to the price hike of the aquaculture inputs, and employed their own family members. And sometimes they also hired some workers inside and outside the community. Activities still going on. That's why we see the positive. It has not COVID not impacted the aquaculture activities in Bangladesh. Now I will discuss about the fisheries-based business operators impact of pandemic on the fisheries-based business operators of Bangladesh. We found that the 3.2% women were included in the as a respondent under the fisheries-based operators. During the pandemic time, the status quo position remains. And livelihood, actually these BOs, they provided a livelihood for their families and communities. And it has been observed that the trade in during the pandemic time, trade in the fish and fishery product has declined 50 to 80%. And it has been figured out in the figure number 3. In case of starting capital and the current capital, we see current capital increase. So the trend of the average capital investment during the pandemic time increased also. So they are engaged with different businesses like fresh and live fish selling and fishing and aquaculture input sale, and also the dry and farm fish processing and live crab and eel trading, including the fish hatcheries. So the consumer demand for fishery products has plummeted in and experienced the cancellation of orders. The movement restrictions limited to the marketing operations throughout the supply chain. All business has been sustained, and their capital has increased, but their capital has been increased around 20% from the initial one. That has been figured out in the figure 3. So in case of government measures and interventions, we see that there were quite a substantial amount of government assistance, including the, in case of the open water fisheries, fisher folks, they got the food and financial support, and also the alternative livelihood assistance from the government program during the fishing ban period. This is a regular program. They do it for the Hilsha during the Hilsha ban period. They do these activities. In case of the small scale aquaculture, the farmers receive some technical assistances, including the from the present development programs, including it was from the government and the NGOs as well. And most interestingly, the Department of Fisheries also supported the transportation to the fish farmers during the early COVID time to transfer their fish from one place to another. And also they established some mobile shops to sell the live fish. And regarding the regional and national lockdown measures, the restriction resulted to difficulty in marketing of their production, and also the movement also impacted. So how they adapted to this situation? Basically, during the COVID time, early COVID time, and in the mid of COVID period, the situation was different. So during the fishing and fishing trips, they hardly maintain the it has been observed from this study that in Bangladesh, the fishermen, either fishermen or the aquaculture operators or the fisheries based the business operators, all didn't maintain the COVID-19 protocols properly, but there were some attempts from the government levels to maintain this. And interestingly, we found that the fisherfolk family members, sometimes they believe that the COVID-19 virus will not contaminate among them, and they have the sufficient immunity to protect themselves from this virus. So it is quite interesting. And they adapted this situation by reducing their cost, and also in some cases they process their fish to dry fish, and also they started selling fish in as live fish, like air-breathing fish like park and the indigenous catfishes. And also they also search for new markets, and they change the farm species to the conventional pangasius, to some farmers change to the small indigenous species like the air-breathing catfishes and also park. And they also engage themselves in online trading and other income opportunities as well. And what other innovative attempts taken by them, and some SSF, that means the small scale fisher folks, also engaged in agriculture, livestock rearing, and other small businesses. And basically in Bangladesh, women fishers not directly involved in the fishing, but they assist in making fishing gears, knitting crafts, and also selling fishes. And so the women's role mostly in some processing plants, they contribute a lot as a worker. Most aquaculture farm employed their family members, but some hired workers from outside the community. And some fisheries-based operators also inspired by innovations like they started retailing their product online, and they started building a business group for better networking. And some fisher FBOs build trust in product and quality and safety. In that case, they use the online platform, the social media, the Facebook, Instagram. They use these tools frequently. And coming to the point of case study highlights, we found an interesting case study. Mrs. Majeda Begum, she often known as the struggle woman. She was a housewife earlier, but during since 2011, after the expiration of her husband, she became a fish vendor and started to establish in this small business. And earlier, her family members are also not liking this business, and they promoted, they wanted to be settled to marry again, something like that. But self-confident Majeda, she was so confident that she overcome all the hurdles and lived alone. Her son is now 12 years old, and he also supported Majeda during the lockdown period when the school were closed. And this Majeda sells about the 20 to 30 kg of fishes daily, and earns about $5 to $10 per day. And what are the highlights of this struggle woman? The demand of fish reduced due to the negative perception and the propaganda during the early COVID period. So the volume of fish sale were dropped during the early pandemic time. She applied innovative ways and collected the mobile contact number of the regular clients, and she gathered the customers' demand one day before and delivered the fishes on the following day to their doorsteps. So by doing this, she survived, and she managed her livelihood well. And but the thing is, due to the COVID time, she has some her living expense were increased, and due to the price hike of some commodities, and also she had to buy the hygiene materials, including medicine. And she also mentioned that most of the people in her community were reluctant to comply with the COVID-19 control measures. And she received the food aid from the government agencies during this COVID period. Now I'll focus on the Cambodia. Cambodia, we see that the gender dimension or the gender participation in the total small scale fisher respondents were about 43.1%. And during the pandemic time, the status quo position remains. And their livelihood mainly depend on the fishing, and including they also do the factory, they work as a factory worker, and also someone also sells fish. And during the pandemic time, it is continued to be the main source of livelihood for most of the respondents. And it has been observed that the household income, average annual household income derived from the fishing was about the 5,526 for the Cambodian small-scale fisher folks. And during the pandemic time, their household income has been dropped reduced to 15 to 18%. And the reason behind the reduction, the less market accessibility and the lower fish price and difficulty in transportation, and also the movement restrictions posed by the government. Businesses, they usually focused on the fishing. Also, they work as a processor, vendor, and agriculture, aquaculture, and sometimes they work as a migratory worker, and sometimes they also work in factory, and also sometimes they work in the construction sites. So during the pandemic time, the protection and control measures were being implemented within the communities, and there were no direct impact on the activities of the fishers. So in case of Cambodia, there was little impact on the small-scale fisher folks. It has been revealed from this study. Now I'll talk about the impact of pandemic on the Cambodian aquaculture operators. It has been observed that the 28.13% respondent from the aquaculture operators were women. And during the pandemic time, the status quo position remains. And the status of livelihood, mainly they deal their livelihood by aqua farming. The 37.5% dealt their livelihood with the aquaculture. Some also do the farming as a factory worker, fish seller, small business, as I mentioned in the earlier slide. And during the pandemic time, the household income dropped by 21%. So the aquaculture in Cambodia was impacted from these study reveals. So household income for the Cambodian aquaculture operators was revealed about the $897.20 US. And during the pandemic time, they had the less market accessibility, and they got the lower price of the products, and they faced the difficulty in transportation as well. So by doing all these aquaculture activities like selling fish, the fishing, agriculture, gleaning, vendor, or as a processor, no serious impacts were found during the pandemic time, and the sector is still operating smoothly. They employed their own family members, and they also hired some workers from inside and outside the community as well. So for the fisheries-based operators, in case of Cambodian fisheries-based operators, we found 19.33% of the FBOs surveyed were the women. So the women participation were also not adequate, but there were some participation. But during the pandemic time, the status quo position remains, no change. And the livelihood status, it provided livelihood for these fisheries-based businesses, provides the livelihood for their families and communities. And during the pandemic time, it seemed to be economically impacted by the COVID-19 up to 50% due to the declining in the value of fish and fishery products. And they are involved in many different businesses like live and fresh fish, wholesale of the fresh fish, and wholesale of the dry fish as well, and retailing and processing of fish, etc. So most of the FBOs met some difficulties, but their overall business operation was continued. So there were little impact on the Cambodian FBOs from these study reveals. Government measures, what the government measures or interventions were put in place in Cambodia. We found that the government assistance at national level, the fisheries communities were provided cash support to increase their livelihood activities, and so they provided some training courses for the livelihoods, and as well as to maintain their SMEs, the small and medium enterprises. And at the provincial level, there were some interventions to assist small-scale fisher folks and aquaculture operators, enabling access to markets. And regarding the regional and national lockdown and movement restrictions, the restrictions resulted to difficulty in marketing of their products, in addition to lower demand. So how they survived? In case of good practices, we found that the COVID-19 protections and measures that being implemented in their communities as very perfectly, and they also adapted by most of the small-scale fisher folks, aquaculture operators, and FBOs faced some difficulties, but their overall business operation was functional. And what kind of innovative ways they applied? Small-scale fisher folks increased time, and also they engaged them into agricultural activities, and also they applied for some selective or the diversified product to meet the clients' demands during the pandemic time. And also they expanded their business through e-commerce or online platform as well. And the aquaculture operators employed their, it has been observed that the aquaculture operators was not hampered so much because they employed their own family members. And the fisheries-based business operators survived their business in various innovative ways, including they retail their product online, and they also build some business groups for better networking. And they also building trust of their product and food safety by promoting in the social media as well. So we are going to highlight some of the information of the Cambodian case study. Here we found Mrs. Viesna. She is 38 years old, and she is a dry fish vendor. She is from Kampong Siam district of the Cambodia. And we found that she started her business as a collector and wholesaler since 2003, and with a starting capital of 20 million real. And actually her siblings introduced to this business, and she operates this business 7 days a week and 6 hours per day. So generally she has two employees who help her in her business. But she had to cut off their salaries during the COVID period. And the major highlights of this case study is that the COVID-19 pandemic impacted on the wholesale operation due to the lockdown measures, as there were no buyers for dry fishes, and also the cancellation of social ceremonies like the wedding or the other birthday parties or other parties. And they also lost daily income, and the fish sale also dropped down. To overcome the situation, she started selling dry fish in retail market. Earlier she was doing wholesale. Now she started doing a retail market, and she started selling about 30 to 100 kg per day, and started supplying to the buyers from the other provinces as well by taking order over the phone. And basically she was not willing to conduct this mobile business or e-commerce. She was not willing to transform into online business, but later she was used to do so. So she also reduced the daily sales quantity to the buyers who made the delay in payment. And she got little knowledge on the COVID-19 control measures, but received updates from the social media and the friends and also TV as well. Now I'm going to my last country report. It will be India. India was one of the most impacted country by the COVID-19 pandemic. We found the participation of gender in the small-scale fisher folks were not satisfactory, was little. But during the pandemic time, their position, the status quo remains. They basically their livelihood dealt with the fishing, but some are dealing with the boat repairing, craft mending, and also fish selling, and also work as a worker in fish harbor, etc. And during the pandemic time, all the fishing activities prior to pandemic reduced about half in the March, and later in the April to July it reduced up to 10%. So the total fishing activity in India during the pandemic time was reduced up to 50 to 60%. And the duration of the fishing also dropped down from 25 days per month to 10 days per month. So the fishing duration also and the total, it obviously reflects that the total catch composition also reduced as well. So besides lockdown measures, the impact the fishing community were also impacted by the seasonal fishing closures and also the cyclone Amphan. These are the triple effect from these cyclone Amphan, fishing closure, and also the COVID-19 pandemic impacted the Indian fishing small-scale fishers badly. So how about the household incomes? The small-scale fisher folks focused on the fishing, and their livelihood was maintained as usual. And during the pandemic time, as the fishing harbors and the landing centers has affected, so the day-to-day earning of the fisher also impacted as well. And it also observed that the COVID-19 halted the processing plants and the disruption of the supply chains, so their margin also reduced. Basically, they are Indian small-scale fishing communities also dealing with fishing, and also they are engaged in processing, also work as a vendor, and also engaged in agriculture and aquaculture activities too. And during the pandemic time, lockdowns and the closed fishing season resulted the reduced catch sizes, and which in turn made their daily income lower. How about the aquaculture operations during the impact of pandemic on the Indian aquaculture operators? The study also reveals that there are less participation from the women in case of aquaculture study, and during the pandemic time, the status remained unchanged. And the livelihood status, they mainly dealing their livelihoods by aquaculture, and someone do the hatchery or nursery, and someone going with the feed mills, the larger scale investors obviously, and some are engaged in processors and wholesalers, also the retailer as well. So during the pandemic time, their production capacity reduced due to they delayed their production. They delayed not only delayed their stocking, they also reduced their stocking amount. So the production also decreased. An increase of cost of production, it is due to the unregulated price hike of some of the products of the supply chain, and they also faced the reduction in the selling prices as well. And their household income provides them the livelihood for their to maintain their livelihood to maintain their family and the community as well. And during the pandemic time, it impacted badly, so that as they got the less market accessibility and the lower price of the production, and the difficulty in transportation as well. So during the pandemic time, it has been observed that in the early pandemic time, the lockdown announcement created panic situation among the farmers, as the processing plants regularly send the vehicles to the farms to collect shrimps or prawns or fishes as well. But during the early pandemic time, they stopped sending the vehicles for collecting the fishes from the farms. So it was the situation during the March to it continued up to June, and after June onwards, the situation improved. And the fisheries-based business operators, in case of we also found less participation in the surveyed FBOs. The status quo position remains, and also during the pandemic time, the average number of days operated by the fish retailers each month reduced considerably, and also they recovered. Although, as I mentioned in earlier talk, that it improved from June onwards. And in case of the businesses, due to there was a positive impact of the promotion in social media and also in the national media as well. The increased awareness among the public that the people need to stay healthy through healthy eating. So it enabled them, enabled the non-vegetarian from the India. They made their seafood as their preferred choice. So, and after June onwards, there was an increase in domestic, the increase in sales of the domestic market of the seafoods. So, what were the government measures or interventions were put in place? Yes, government has some financial stimulus packages. But it will come into effect at the end of 2021 or in early 2022. So really, they are not getting the support on the time. But on the other hand, they are trying to support by supporting the small scale and the small and medium scale entrepreneurs by providing the Blue Revolution integrated development and management of fisheries to selecting the small and medium scale fisheries entrepreneurs to start doing the seaweeds or the marine finfish like the sea bass, etc. So what were the regional and national lockdown movement restrictions? The government clarified there were no restriction on the so in the early COVID time, there was a panic situation among the farmers. But later on, the government clarified that there were no restriction on the movement of the vehicles of the fisheries and aquaculture sector, and which allowed the processing plants and the feed mills to function their day-to-day works with the minimum staff. So the government measures were put in place in India, and there were mixed experiences. So how they survived? What were the coping mechanisms applied in India? COVID-19 for the good practices, the COVID-19 protection and measures are being implemented among the communities or within the communities, and they although they made some difficulties, but their overall business operation was functional. And like other countries, they also applied some innovative ways to continue their businesses. Like they survived their businesses by retailing products online and building the business groups for better networking, and also building trust among for raising perception of the product quality and the safety as well. So finally, I will go on to give you some highlights of the Indian case study. We found Mr. Joy Ipekurian. He's a 68 years old male from Kerala, and actually he was earlier doing job with the Department of Fisheries, and after retirement he joined in this fishing business, and he also reported that during this lockdown period, the fishing harbors were closed, and it has affected their daily income and the daily fishing hour as well. And they are also impacted by the seasonal fishing ban, which were impacted in the southwestern part, is 15 June to the 31st July. And so they had the impact from seasonal fishing ban and also from the COVID as well. We can highlight from some of his information from here. They actually couldn't operate the fishing boats during March to July, and they resumed operation again during the August and November. So their average length of fishing trip reduced 10 to 12 days. Earlier it was 25 days. So the physical distance between the crew members at sea and also the lack of the necessary equipments to maintain the sanitary measures made the fishing difficult. So it was one of the challenge for them. And for this, they observed that they are fishing, the average catch also reduced during 2020 is reduced to 2 metric ton, whereas in 2016 it was 7.5 metric ton and 3 metric ton in 2019. So these decline, the reason behind the decline was the seasonal fishing ban and also the cyclone Ampan and also the COVID. So these triple effect impacted the small scale fisher folks of India very badly. So I stop here and thank you very much for your attention. And I am happy to answer any queries regarding this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sujit. So I'll move on to the next 3 countries, which is Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand. So if we look at the small scale fisher folks, or rather how they fared during before the pandemic and during the pandemic in Indonesia, in terms of gender dimension, there was limited engagement of women in general. Before the pandemic, there's limited engagement of women in the capture fisheries, as well as fish cleaners, but they're generally more involved in fish processing activities. And this did not change during the pandemic. So it was basically, there was not much of difference. In terms of status of livelihood, again, fishing was the main livelihood for the small scale fisher folks. And this continued to be the main source of livelihood even during the pandemic. In terms of how the household income was impacted, an average in the respondents, based on the respondents' feedback, the average annual income ranged from between 10 and 40 million Indonesian rupiah. And there was a general decrease in terms of the household income across the subsets of the small scale fisher folks during the pandemic. And this was basically because of the general decrease in yield composition, because in normal times, there are consistent high yield, good composition of catch, a good supply of raw materials, processing additives, production and income. So this declined during the pandemic period. And also there were less government assistance in the form of living allowances, and whereas it didn't reach to some areas of the subsets of small scale fishers. So this generally caused a decrease in the household income for the small scale fisher folks. In terms of aquaculture operators, in this cluster group, there were basic, or rather absolute minimal participation of women, with only one female fish farmer who was interviewed as a respondent, and this basically is also the structure of how is it before the pandemic and during the pandemic. So that's why the responses received were also not very significant. In general, the aquaculture operators are family-owned operation units and who are also involved in other agricultural activities. And during the pandemic, when there was a decrease in demand due to the government-imposed COVID-19 restrictions, there was a general decrease in household income as well. Again, the average annual income for this particular cluster was greater than Indonesian rupiah 40 million on average from this cluster group that were interviewed. In terms of businesses, or rather how it was during before the pandemic, in general, the aquaculture operators had high yield stock densities, but this had to be reduced during the pandemic, particularly in terms of frequency of culture, from 3 to 4 times to 2 to 3 times a year, as well as the reduction in stock density as well. Basically, they didn't have access to wet markets and direct consumers, and they had to resort to other means. And in terms of government assistance, these were also received, or rather was received only by certain groups, or rather certain participants or respondents who reportedly received this government assistance, while some received living allowances, material and financial support. In terms of fisheries, in the fisheries business operators cluster, this is where the is dominated by women, both before the pandemic and during the pandemic. It continued, and they basically, the women are basically the main livelihood for the family units, and they trade from home in terms of fishery and fishery products, where the husband usually goes for the fishing, and then the products are being used or processed by the wives at home, and they trade these products, process these products, and they trade from home. Again, the general decrease in demand during the pandemic caused the decrease in household income, which in average is usually above Indonesian rupiah 40 million. So as mentioned, generally they trade at home as collectors or distributors to processors and traders in the market, where some of the other products that are being produced are also dried fishery products. Many, or rather some of the respondents switched to online sales to improve their business performance, while some did not move into this direction. There was some government assistance provided in the form of living allowances for this particular group. Financial challenges remain one of the main factors that called for the restructuring of the rather financial restructuring, as adding new investors or adding or scheduling debts for some of these businesses. In terms of how the coping mechanisms in terms of how the businesses coped, or rather the impacts, the interventions and policies measures taken, such as the limited government assistance and support in the form of living allowances, materials, and financial and technical advice. These interventions had some good and some positive and negative impacts. Those who received it had impacts, as in provided good support, as well as those subsidized the loss in the household income for those who received this assistance, whereas those who did not receive this assistance had to a certain extent were significantly impacted. In terms of the regional and national lockdown and movement restrictions, the closure of markets and direct interaction with consumers were affected, which caused a decrease in demand and sales. As mentioned earlier, the demand for fish and fishery products remained strong in this region, in most countries in this region, whereas the disruption to the supply chain is the one that caused, or rather has been the one that caused a significant impact to the sector. There were challenges These challenges led to innovation ways to doing business, such as online marketing, and also sales via social media platforms such as Facebook. This was also popularly used by some of the respondents in order to survive or thrive during this period. There were manuals produced to mitigate the COVID-19 impacts made available by the governments, and these provided support and sustained community fisheries, post-harvest fisheries, and trade in order to minimize the impacts of COVID-19. In terms of coping mechanisms, we can say that the reasons for success of the businesses, like whether it's small-scale fisher folks, whether aquaculture operators or fisheries-based operators, the reasons for the success during this pandemic period can be attributed to the government assistance in form of living allowance, materials, financial and technical advice, which reached to some of these sectors of the small-scale group. And also those who ventured into e-commerce, online sales and marketing also benefited from this area of technology. In terms of reasons for failure, we could say are those who were not able to reach or get access to the support from the government, and not providing enough support also to reach alternative market avenues due to this. In general, health protocol advice was understood by the general group, these cluster groups. They were understood, however, it was reported also, but not necessarily many adhered to this. And I think this is across the board to many countries within this region. Adaptation strategies were one of the reasons of the success. We can say the use of delivery service providers, financial restructuring of business operations by adding new jobs during side jobs, having other side jobs to fall on, consolidated efforts as in joint marketing and cooperation partnerships were also some of the adaptation strategies used by the sector or the clusters in order to survive during this period. Innovations through social, institutional, and technological institutes also improved the awareness on digital and electronic marketing systems for the expansion of fisheries value chain and market chains, as well as reducing the stock culture also helped. One of the ways on how the industry coped as it reduced the costs and also the other option, the other strategy was investing in high value local species that catered to certain groups of consumers. In terms of case study highlights in this next few countries that we're presenting, what was found out that there are groups, the case studies could be grouped into several categories where there were similar ways on how the clusters survived or used various adopted strategies in order to survive. And in Indonesia, the case study highlights are basically what the industry adapted to was doing side jobs. This was one of the points that was cited by a number of respondents. They were doing side jobs in order to increase incomes. The other method that was used was the consolidating merchandise in delivery, as in a group of small-scale fishers got their products together and they used that to have this delivery service offered to consumers. One interesting case study was this particular person called Mr. Pandu, who switched his business from farming into a carp nursery business, which to him provided better returns, and it was provided him with more income compared to his normal aquaculture farm. So changing market strategies, cooperating with online marketing service provider platforms also was another way on how some of these businesses survive, particularly this gentleman here started doing online business, and he's been doing pretty well by also combining, consolidating merchandise with other small scale businesses. And he also even has future plans to have his own brand for these products that is being developed right now. And this is the Mr. Pandu, which was mentioned just now. And in normal times, this area, particular area in West Java, where they're popular for as tourist spots. In normal times, they are popular for Sundanese cuisine. And one of the fish that is popular is this gourami fishes. So during this pandemic, when a number of tourists got impacted, Pandu decided to reduce the number of carp cultivated and shifted to nursery business instead. And in this way, he reduced the risks of faced in fish farming and having access to markets. And he found that his return on the capital was even faster than going into farming of carps. We move on to Malaysia. In Malaysia, in terms of small-scale fisher folks, the gender dimension, in general, the participation of women is relatively low, both before the pandemic and during the pandemic. In terms of status of livelihoods, fishing was the main livelihood for small-scale fisher folks, and it continued to be the main source of livelihood in terms of income generation, poverty alleviation, and also food security. The average household income from the respondents were between 3,000 to 60,000 ringgit. However, during the pandemic, there was nearly 54% decrease in terms of household income per month. And this was because in regular times, 95% of the catch are sold in the markets, whereas the rest are kept, a small percentage is kept for personal consumption. So the movement restrictions, the limited wet market operating hours had a significant impact on the household income. Consumer preference to trade online for health and safety reasons were also there. So, but small-scale fishers to a certain extent had limited access to having their products sold online. So this was basically the lack of business innovative initiatives or measures trying to, or rather adopted by this cluster group. In terms of aquaculture operators, there were relatively good engagement of women in this operation, both before the pandemic and during the pandemic. Aquaculture remains the main livelihood, although there are some aquaculture operators who have more than one job in this area. And based on the respondents, 62% of the livelihood were impacted by the pandemic, and mainly because of the movement restrictions that caused the less demand from consumers, as well as the number of workers were also lacking. Average income, household income from this particular cluster group ranges from 3,600 to 180,000 ringgit. And based on the responses that we received, there was a general decrease in household income, and there was also extra costs on household expenditure related to COVID-19 test kits and medicine and sanitary kits were also cited as some of the extra costs that they felt was a burden for them. 90% of the harvested yields are sold in the market from the aquaculture operators, and these movement restrictions limited this access to wet market operation hours. There were prohibition of Sunday and night markets, so this impacted this aquaculture group as well. Online businesses boomed during this time. In Malaysia, there was a significant increase in sales of through the online media, social media. However, small-scale fishers as well as aquaculture operators were not able to sell online, as mentioned earlier, due to the lack of business innovative initiatives and measures. They didn't really attempt to move towards this direction. In terms of fishery-based operators, fishery business-based operators, they were based on the responses that we received. The gender dimension was not really specified. So, but in general, we see there were actually more women in this area as well. The status of livelihoods are generally the owners and the employees processes, owners and employees of processes and retail business are this particular cluster group. Have been impacted, the livelihoods have been impacted due to the movement restrictions again during the pandemic, basically because of limited market hours related to activities along the supply chain. The average income here, I think there is, sorry, there's a, I think there's an error in the income here mentioned, apologies for that, but there is a general decrease in terms of household income for this cluster group. And this cluster group are basically owners and employees. It's more family related businesses, and the requirement to comply with government COVID-19 measures were also one of the reasons how this particular group was affected. And these FBOs generally produce or marketed products such as fish crisps, or locally known as keropok ikan, fermented and smoked fish, as well as shrimp pastes. In terms of government measures and impacts, there were limited assistance provided, and for those beneficiaries, and for those beneficiaries, the support actually subsidized the losses in the household income. The issuance of authorization letters to licensed and registered operators to facilitate the ease of distribution of fish and fishery products at roadblocks. These particularly helped to a certain extent when some of the went towards a certain part of the pandemic. Fisheries industries were recognized as essential services, and these helped to facilitate, or rather provide the support required by these industries. E-commerce initiative was leveraged with Agro Bazaar Online and Nikmat Biz, which is the Fisheries Association group, to establish partnership with private companies in implementing additional incentives based on financial assistance schemes. Important to highlight here also, the Fisheries Association in Malaysia, Nikmat, also worked together with an online platform called Shopee to help to market the products that were being supplied by small-scale fishers as well. The regional and national lockdown and movement restrictions limited market hours and operating hours for fishing. As a result, less catch and decrease in income was observed. The hike in price of fish feed and interruption to the distribution of fish and fishery products were also one of the impacts of the sector. The challenge remains, though, in terms of doing businesses in innovative ways, but it's interesting to observe how many small-scale businesses have survived or were doing very well during this pandemic by applying, or rather, simple, innovative ways of marketing the products using social media. The coping mechanisms in terms of reasons for success for the sector can be attributed to the government assistance, which helped to ease the loss of business and income to some extent. And also those who ventured into e-commerce, online sales and marketing, it was a plus point for them for survival. Again, in terms of reasons for failure, we had those who received less government support, or rather did not get access, were not able to move further, or rather were the ones who did not really have the opportunity to move further with other innovations. Health protocols and restrictions were complied with, and these are some of the good practices that were maintained. and the provision of, or rather the acknowledgement of fisheries as an essential service sector in Malaysia helped to actually support this particular group of fishers. In terms of adaptation strategies, government interventions to ensure distribution of fish and fishery products continued. And this is, as I mentioned, was through NICMAT. In a short while, I'll just show a quick video on how this was done. Also through issuance of authorization letters to licensed and registered fishing business operations. Government support in terms of partnership with private companies, as I mentioned just now, to offer incentive-driven financial assistance also was some of the adaptation strategies that were used to support this small-scale fishers group clusters. E-commerce and online business has become an important platform to sell food items, including fish and fishery products in Malaysia. So as I mentioned just now, in terms,
yes. I just want to let you know that we are going on overtime already, okay?
Okay, yeah, let me just quickly. So in terms of case studies, as I mentioned just now, the highlight of Malaysia was the online businesses had become an important platform to sell fish and fishery products because of the high demand, and social media played a very big role in terms of supporting this sector. We move on to Thailand now, and in Thailand, in terms of small-scale fisher folks, we have 15% of small-scale fisher folks surveyed were women, and the situation was similar before the pandemic and during the pandemic. The status of livelihood, fishing was the main livelihood, and this continued. I think this across the region continues to be a similar situation. We also observe a general decrease in household income in terms of for this particular cluster group, and this was basically because there were less consumers, nearly 83% in terms of decline in customers, and less income by nearly 71%. Small-scale fisher folks were highly compliant, and few of them really changed the occupation to become cooks or food vendors. Aquaculture operators, nearly 20% of those who were respondents were women. This was a primary source of livelihood and decreased during the COVID-19 period. Also, again, nearly 90% decrease in household income. And this was basically due to a significant decline in customers and income. And if you can see, the businesses basically focused on shrimp and other products such as snake skin, gourami, and clams and groupers. Fishery-based operators, you see 70% of the operators surveyed were women. And again, this was the main livelihood for this particular cluster group. And we also saw a general decrease in household income. 66% or rather 67% were not significantly affected, but they still did experience order cancellation and shortage of cash. Among the government measures and impacts, there were exemption fees for aquaculture permission license, support for production inputs, compensate. So quite a bit of support that was provided by the government, which gave the support to the industry. Research and development initiatives also focused on promoting smart farming and increasing production efficiency. And this also provided the support required by the sector. In terms of regional and national lockdown restrictions, resulted in low fish prices and which made farmers unable to sell the produce or rather difficulty in importing and exporting. So in some regions, the domestic markets became pretty strong. Coping mechanisms, just to quickly say that the reasons for success are very much dependent, or rather the main reasons for success were the government assistance, which was already mentioned just now. And the reasons for failure are basically not fully utilizing the interventions and adapting to the changes in terms of business dynamics, including the use of digitalization. All clusters were highly compliant to the health protocols during as part of the good practices. Some of the adaptation strategies were reducing fishing efforts and processing to reduce cost, looking for new markets, changing species, engaging in a line, basically changing the way selling your products. Development of use and water quality applications, underwater oxygen generation. Some of these technologies were the innovations used to adapt or cope with the situation with the COVID-19 pandemic in Thailand. Just to quickly highlight some of the case studies in where small-scale fishermen grouped together, they produced and did the marketing, and this is where they created new and direct trading channels via online platforms. Products such as snappers and crabs were created alternative opportunities for this particular group of small-scale fisher folks operating in Chumphon and Samut Sakhon provinces. Then we also had operators of red tilapia who moved from cage culture to smaller smaller farms in order to reduce the cost and still maintain their business. So just to quickly sum up, as mentioned by Sujit earlier, the key challenges to the study is the intermittent lockdowns and movement restrictions in many of the countries. Also, what we noticed was the smaller gender representation in some particular clusters within the countries, the existence of bans, and also the national disasters. But as a preliminary conclusion, although we have not completed the 8 countries, we just received the results from Philippines, although we are not included this, it's a carefully crafted government intervention is required, interventions are required in order to customize and focus, to have a customized and focused, well-defined regulations to support this particular group. There should be greater priorities for small-scale fisheries at the national level, including providing support throughout the value chain in terms of in producing, processing, and marketing. More gender participation should be encouraged, particularly women, which we are still lacking in some cluster groups. Women are good entrepreneurs, and this should be encouraged. Greater education and awareness on potential of digital markets and online platforms should be encouraged, as we see this is already proving to be potential in moving a business forward. Very importantly, also maintaining the quality produced and ensuring market pathways for production and consumer needs is a priority that needs to be also focused for the small scale groups or trained in order to not only have better access to markets, but also better value for the products that they produced. So we'd like to thank FAO Regional Office for the Asia and the Pacific for giving us this opportunity to undertake this study, and also to all the representatives, coordinators in the survey countries. Your contribution is much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shirlene and Sujit, for presenting the preliminary findings. There is a question about the report, and we would like to let our participants know that the final output will be a publication, and those who have registered in the webinar will receive the link when the publication is out by early next year. So as of now, the draft report is still being prepared by Shirlene and Sujit and her team. We are already over time, but maybe you can respond to, there's a comment here. As far as COVID-19 is concerned, I believe that the inference of the impact of the pandemic on the fishing activity needs to include the populations involved in fishing-related businesses, ice producers, motor engine providers. I would like to know whether a thorough study is underway regarding the overall impact of the pandemic within the region. Shirlene or Sujit, would you like to comment on this?
Yeah, I do agree with that statement that, a thorough study is required to cover all stakeholders in the industry. But this particular study, as mentioned, is a purposive study that once going to aimed at looking at only the small scale fishes, how they particularly coped during this region, during this pandemic. What we wanted to know, or what we aimed to find out, is how they survived, what particular what special innovation or adaptation they made to survive during this, because they have limited access to resources. So because of that, those actors are of course not included. I'm not aware if there's a bigger study that covers this whole group taking place. I should think there should be. In fact, there are many studies, researchers going on, surveys going out there on this study of the impact of COVID-19, but this particular one is on small scale fishes.
Okay, thank you, Shirlene. And maybe one more. Here is the comment or a clarification. For Cambodia and Bangladesh, when we see so drastic difference in average household income change in 2020 from 2019 for FBOs on one hand, and SSF and aquaculture operators on the other hand in both countries, could that indicate that governmental measures aimed at alleviating the sufferings of, or alleviating the sufferings of, alleviating the sufferings of consequences did not reach to the FBOs? And another follow-up is, in case of Cambodia, had the annual household income increased tenfold from 897 in 2016 to 8997 in 2019 before being hit by COVID-19 in 2020 with roughly 20% reduction? And then regarding the second presentation, for clarification, did the average household income in Thailand decrease 90% for aquaculture operators, or did 90% of aquaculture operators endure a decrease in household income? So this is for both of you. If you could provide a clarification.
Yeah, maybe I can mention, since the question is asking on Cambodia, I think the second one is it's a typo error, I think, Sujit. The question B.
Yeah, alleviating that one.
Yeah. No, in case of Cambodia, the annual household income increased tenfold. Is it?
Yeah.
It's an error?
Is it? Can you just check?
I can go to there.
Yeah, because it's 897 to 8997. So yeah, that's a big jump.
Yeah.
In terms of the question for the Thailand, it's not 90% of aquaculture operators endured. No, this was the decrease of 90% in household income for the aquaculture operators.
Okay. Sujit, are you able to do that quickly? We are going to share the recording.
Yes,
no?
Yes, Susanna. Actually, that one, the minimum, that was the range. That one maximum, and there was a minimum one, and also there is a average one. So the figure mentioned here is the maximum one. So for your better information, actually the analysis is still not finished. So we request you to wait for the final report to come out. And I would like to respond the first part of the question. The government measures aimed alleviating the sufferings. Actually, yes, the government measures are already were there, already put in place. But according to the number of FBOs or the number of small scale fishery picks is huge. So it is not very easy job to reach every fisher folk or every aquaculture business operators to cover all. So that's why it's a big challenge for all of us. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you both for presenting the highlights. As I would like to repeat that there will be a publication that will come out in early 2022, and that we will disseminate the link to that publication when it comes out. There will also be a recording and the registered, Shirley, that would be possible, correct? for the registered participants to get access to that link to the webinar. So we have exhausted all our time for the webinar. So we should leave it there. We thank you for staying for our participants, and thank you so much for the interest in the preliminary findings of the study. And of course, thank you to our colleagues from INFOFISH for presenting, and to my colleagues also for being here. So thank you, everyone, and have a
Thank
good
you.
rest of the day or your good evening. Bye-bye.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Susan. Thank you all.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone.